Thank you very much for inviting me. We've got a lot to talk about here. What I'm going to do is talk initially about microwave frequency EMFs and how they work, because understanding that is essential to understanding 5G. So we'll be emphasizing that, the kinds of exposures that we're already exposed to from cell phones and cordless phones and cell phone towers and Wi-Fi, et cetera, smart meters and so forth. And then we're going to transition to 5G. So, U.S. and international safety guidelines, as Elizabeth Kelly just mentioned, are based on only thermal, that is heating effects. But there are many non-thermal effects that occur at levels orders of magnitude lower than those allowed by these guidelines. So these guidelines have been known to be completely inadequate for many, many years. And these inadequacies are shown by the many different review articles that have reported a variety of different effects that occur. And so I'm going to talk about 8 different effects where there are huge numbers of review articles, which means there's a vast primary literature citation showing that these things occur, and therefore there should be no question about their occurrence. The first 3 of these, we're going to talk about lowered fertility. There have been studies on lowered fertility, both in humans and in animals. And you see changes in the structure of the testis, of the ovaries. You get lowered sperm count, lowered sperm quality, lowered number of eggs. You get increased spontaneous abortion. You get lowered levels of each of the 3 sex hormones, and you also get lowered libido. So there should be no question that there are quite a variety of different effects on producing lowered fertility. There are also widespread neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. We have 25 reviews that have been published on that. You get insomnia, fatigue, depression, headache, lack of concentration, cognitive dysfunction, anxiety, stress, agitation, memory dysfunction. You also get dysfunction of the sensory organs. So you have major brain changes that have been studied at great length in animals. And so we have a lot of different effects that have been reported over and over and over again in these reviews. There should be no question about their occurring. And these effects, as you've seen, are becoming so common in all of our technologically advanced countries on Earth. So we're very far along in terms of these effects in human populations. There's cellular DNA damage of 3 different types, which I've listed here. These are important for causation of both cancer and also germline mutations that would cause mutations in any future babies that are born with them. There's apoptosis, which is a mechanism of programmed cell death that occurs. 13 reviews on that. These are very important for a lot of different effects, particularly the reproductive effects and the neurodegenerative effects. So we've talked about one, we haven't talked about the other at this point. Oxidative stress and free radical damage. There are 19 reviews on that occurring over and over and over again, and that's responsible for a large number of different effects. Let me just say that oxidative stress and free radical damage is involved in almost every single chronic disease you can name. There are also hormonal effects, that is endocrine effects. There are 12 different reviews on that, and they are a variety of different hormones have been shown to be affected by the EMFs. You get excessive levels of intracellular calcium in the cells of our body, and that, as I'll discuss shortly, is the cause of almost everything else that we're going to talk about. So this is the basic cause of almost everything that we're concerned about. There are 35 reviews on cancer causation by EMFs, and as you've already heard, it's almost inexplicable, but we're still discussing whether cancer is occurring, and that's, I think, ridiculous based simply on these very large numbers of reviews. Now, one of the things about the EMFs that's been long established is that pulsed EMFs that pulse up and down very rapidly, are in most cases much more biologically active than our non-pulsed or what are called continuous wave EMFs. And so we're comparing here pulsed EMFs with continuous wave EMFs of the same average exposure and same average intensity. Now, because all wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations, they are potentially, and I believe actually, much more dangerous. And this is something that's widely ignored by the industry over and over and over again, despite the fact that studies on this go back well into the 1970s, and there have been huge numbers of studies over the years on these things. So there are also other effects which I've listed as probable effects, where there's also substantial evidence, but not the kind of overwhelming evidence that I discussed for those other 9 issues. There are cardiac effects that work via the electrical control of the heart that are important. There's very, very early onset Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, which are of concern. There's specific concern about both ADHD and autism in terms of causation by late prenatal and early postnatal EMF exposures. And there's also electromagnetic hypersensitivity, EHS. We don't really have time to talk about the kinds of evidence that are involved in leading to these effects. Okay, so I published a paper in 2013 showing that there were large numbers of studies which showed that you could block or greatly lower the effects of EMFs, and a lot of these were done in cell culture, by using what are known as calcium channel blockers. These are drugs which are specific for blocking what are called voltage-gated calcium channels. And the voltage-gated calcium channels, which I abbreviate VGCCs as you see there, are channels that occur in the membrane that surrounds our cells. So every cell in our body is surrounded by a plasma membrane, and these are channels in the membrane such that when those channels open up, which is what happens on EMF exposure, you get huge amounts of calcium flowing into the cell. And it's the excessive calcium in the cell that's responsible for most, if not all, of biological effects. And what's surprising here is that it's not just microwave frequency EMFs that do this. All the EMFs, all the way ranging from millimeter wave things that are going to be involved in 5G, through microwaves, through radio frequency, through intermediate frequency, extremely low frequency from our power wiring, and also even static electrical fields and static magnetic fields. They all work through the same target to activate these VGCCs. That's really quite striking, and obviously is a important finding. So we have we also have some other voltage-gated ion channels that are also activated, but the VGCCs seem to be the most important of them in terms of producing effects. And all of these channels then that are activated by the EMFs are controlled by a structure called the voltage sensor. This is a structure which detects electrical changes across the plasma membrane and can open channels in response to those changes. And what I'm going to tell you is that that voltage sensor is extraordinarily sensitive to the forces to the electrical forces that are produced by these very low intensity EMFs that we're talking about. And so industry acknowledges that microwave frequency and lower frequency EMFs can put forces on charged groups, positive and negatively charged groups. But the industry states that the forces are too weak to do anything. And what I'm going to show you is why that is clearly not true. So this is a kind of a two-dimensional model of the VGCCs with the voltage sensors. And I'm using this not because it's accurate in all respects, but because it's understandable. And so I can talk about it more easily. Now, so if you look at this structure, what you'll see is there are 4 different domains in this protein that look very similar to each other. So Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each of them contains 6 of these cylinders that are listed here. Each of those cylinders is an alpha helix, which is a kind of a structure in a protein that has a kind of a helical structure. So the whole structure as a whole looks like a cylinder. And what you'll see here is that the 4th helix in each of these domains is colored orange, and that's to tell you it's different, okay? I mean, it really doesn't have a different color, but this is to communicate to you that it's different. And what you'll see is those orange helices each have 5 positive charges in it. You see the plus, 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 pluses going up and down those? Those 4 helices are collectively the voltage sensor. They are the structure which detects electrical changes and opens the channel, okay? So they've got a total of 20 charges in them. And those helices, unlike this structure, are actually tilted so that they are actually within the fatty section of the membrane. So the membrane is shown here. You can see it with these things. And those positive charges are all within this fatty section from here to there of the membrane. And that's important for 2 very important reasons. One is that according to Coulomb's law, this is a law of physics that was stated initially in 1784, so this is an old law of physics, and it states that the forces on those charges is inversely proportional to the dielectric constant in which they occur. And the dielectric constant of the fatty parts of the membrane is about 1/120th of the dielectric constant of the aqueous parts of the cell and of our body. So what that means then is the forces are about 120 times stronger, okay, because of Coulomb's law. And so we have 3 factors, in fact, that influence the electrical forces on this, and this all comes out of the basic physics. So the physics is very important here. And, there we go. So one is there are 20 charges on the voltage sensor, not just one. So if you're comparing this now with singly charged groups in the aqueous parts of the cell, the forces are 20 times stronger because of there are 20 charges. This doesn't, there we go. Coulomb's law, because of the dielectric constant, says they're 120 times stronger because of the dielectric constant. And then there's another factor that's even bigger, and that is the plasma membrane has a very high electrical resistance. And another old law of physics, Ohm's law, predicts that the electrical gradients across the plasma membrane are amplified about 3,000-fold across the plasma membrane because of that. And so we have those 3 factors, and what you then get is that again, comparing it with singly charged groups in the aqueous parts of the cell, the forces on the voltage sensor are about 7.2 million times stronger. So this is an extraordinarily powerful force on these, and this is why the VGCCs are so sensitive to these EMFs, and how you can then get these various effects at extremely low exposures. And so basically says that all the industry claims about safety are completely and utterly wrong, and it's shown by this. Now let me just say the 7.2 million calculation is an approximation. I'm not arguing this number is precisely right, but what it shows is the kind of order of magnitude that we're talking about here, and it's truly extraordinary. There was a study published by Takia et al. in 2016 which showed that you can take isolated plasma membranes, no cells at all, and the VGCCs in those membranes can be activated by microwave frequency EMFs in a totally in vitro system. So there's no cells, there's no regulation, there's no nothing. It's a direct effect on the VGCCs. There are 4 reasons why EMFs are much more active in children than in adults. And the first of them is that children have much higher surface to volume ratios, and they also have thinner skulls, so the brains are more sensitive, but in general their bodies are more sensitive. There are 3 other reasons that have been discussed by various scientists that are each quite important. One is that children have very high densities of stem cells, and the stem cells have been shown to be very sensitive to the EMFs. This has been discussed by Dr. Belyaya, so that's one important thing. The developing brain appears to be especially sensitive to the EMFs, and I won't have time to talk about how I think this what the mechanisms are that are involved here. And then fourthly, and this is something Dr. Davis has talked about, young tissues have much greater extracellular water content, and for that reason, the effects of the EMFs are much more deeply penetrating into young tissues. So these effects on, well, I guess the effects on of Wi-Fi and of cell phone towers in schools are of particular concern because of this, because the children in the schools are particularly sensitive to these EMFs. How then do you get effects through these? And the answer really comes from this figure here. These are all known pathways. So you get various kinds of EMFs that activate the VGCCs and produce increases in intracellular calcium. That's Ca2 plus I don't know if you can see this in the back, is intracellular calcium. And one of the things you get, calcium signaling is extremely important in the cells of our bodies. And so if you have excessive calcium in the cell, you get excessive calcium signaling. That can cause all kinds of problems, and they can produce pathophysiological, that is, damaging effects. You can also get damaging effects because you can get you get increases in both nitric oxide and superoxide from the calcium. Those two react with each other extremely rapidly to form peroxynitrite, which is this guy. Peroxynitrite is a potent oxidant that breaks down to form reactive free radicals, produce oxidative stress, and that in turn activates NF-kappa B, which produces inflammation. So you get chronic inflammation, you get oxidative stress, you get a lot of damage from peroxynitrite and free radicals. All of those can then contribute to the pathophysiological effects, which we've talked about before. Let me just say one other thing about this, and that is there are genuine therapeutic effects of these EMFs, and they have to be recognized as well. Under suitable conditions, you can get, by focusing the EMFs on a particular part of the body that has a problem at the appropriate level, you can get therapeutic effects, and they're thought to occur through this pathway that I've indicated here. So, okay, so let's go on here. So what I have is I have a table which describes how each of these effects are produced through those mechanisms that we talked about. We don't have time to talk about these, so basically what I'm doing is just flashing through these basically to show you that, yeah, we do have reasons, we do have understandings of how these things can occur. Yeah, go ahead, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things about these effects is that a number of them are, based on the best available evidence, appear to be cumulative, and as they become more severe, they are apparently irreversible. And so that gives us a very great concern. And so let me just say my personal concern, my biggest three concerns, have to do with the three first things that I listed originally when we started talking about those 8 different effects at the beginning of my talk. I'm very concerned about the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects and the fact that as they accumulate over time and become more severe and irreversible, that we will see, I believe within a few years, a crash in our collective brain function. And if we in fact see that, we'll just go into utter chaos because everything is dependent on our collective brain function. I've estimated, and this is a very rough estimate, and I want to emphasize that, I've estimated based on what human studies we have and what animal studies we have, that we may actually expect to see that, and those are already far along in our society. I mentioned that before. We may see a crash in our collective brain function in something like 5 to 7 years. So, this is a very rough estimate, but I think that the risks that we're taking are absolutely extraordinary. They're risks that no rational society on Earth can possibly take, but we are taking them. And that's based on the exposures we already have. I also think we're looking at a crash in our reproductive function. And I think we're already, again, far along in that process. And I also think that the first evidence of such an absolute crash in reproduction have occurred in 3 East Asian countries, starting in 2017. So I'm very concerned about that. And the third thing I'm very concerned about are the possible massive impacts on our gene pool caused by the EMF-induced germline mutations. Here, I really don't know how far along we are. I found no good information about what's happened to human mutation frequencies over the last 15 or 20 years. And we need that information, but I haven't been able to find any such. So I don't know how far along that is. Let's talk about 5G. Now, 5G will entail, as I think Elizabeth Kelly has already mentioned, the use of much higher frequencies than the current microwave frequency devices. This will allow 5G to carry much higher levels of pulsations and therefore carry much more information per second. So the amount of information that can be carried is much greater, and that is the essential attractive feature of 5G for the industry. However, the 5G millimeter wave EMFs are much more absorbed by building materials and other materials, including materials in our bodies. Now, both the frequency and pulsation of 5G predict that it will be much more active in activating the VGCC voltage sensor. And the reason is, first of all, we've already talked about the pulsations. This is going to be extraordinarily highly pulsed. And secondly, the simple fact that these are absorbed so readily suggests that they're going to interact with charge groups much more actively. And therefore, they'll be much more active in activating the voltage sensor of the VGCCs. So I'm deeply concerned about that. Because 5G millimeter wave radiation is much more absorbed by building materials, the plan is to put out tens of millions of these antennae all over the place in close juxtaposition to all of our homes and all of our other buildings, making it essentially impossible to avoid high-level exposures, especially if we're outdoors. There we have, it's much more difficult to protect ourselves. Each of these properties suggests that 5G will be vastly more dangerous than our already existing exposures, and our already existing exposures, as I just stated, are already extremely dangerous. The industry claims that 5G will be largely absorbed in the outer 1 millimeter or so of the body. And to the extent this is true, most other living organisms will be impacted much more than we will. Why? Because we have relatively large bodies. And so, let me just say, what I'm going to tell you is there is some truth to this, but there is also a substantial untruth to this. To the extent that it's true, insects, small mammals, and birds will be much more impacted than we will. The same thing is true of plants, including even large trees, whose leaves and reproductive organs are highly exposed. I predict that there will be major ecological disasters, including massive fires, with these last being caused by the fact that EMFs make plants much more flammable. It is my opinion that the stunning heat of the recent California fires is likely to be caused by the impact of our already extant EMFs on plants. While the industry claims that 5G effects will be limited to the outer 1 millimeter of the body, they've also been claiming that microwave frequency EMFs will be limited to the outer 1 centimeter or so of the body, and we know that this is untrue. And so I'm going to discuss the deepest known penetration of microwave frequency EMFs, and then return to the question about how both the microwave and also the 5G millimeter waves can act very deeply in the body. So Professor Hessig and his colleagues in Switzerland published 2 studies showing that pregnant cattle grazing near a cell phone tower produce large numbers of newborn calves with high incidences of cataracts. So the calf fetus, who's buried very deeply in the mother's body, should be protected from these EMFs, according to what the industry claims, and there should never be any effects on the fetus. But here you have these very clear effects that are occurring something like 40 times deeper than the industry claims is possible. So how then can that happen? And I think that while the okay, so let's talk about so how can these effects be very deep in the body? So the fact is, electromagnetic fields are made up of both an electrical and a magnetic component. The electrical component is absorbed much more readily in materials, including the materials of our bodies, than the magnetic components. This has been known for decades. And so there is an argument to say that most of the electrical effects of 5G will be absorbed in the outer 1 millimeter of the body. However, the magnetic parts are vastly more penetrating. And because of that, they can go into the body. What they can do is they can put forces on ions that are dissolved in the aqueous parts of our bodies. And when they put forces on those charged groups, what do? They cause them to move. And that in turn will reconstitute the electrical part of the EMF deep in the body, exactly the same frequency, exactly the same pulsations, just at much lower intensity. But when you've got the voltage sensor that's extraordinarily sensitive to these EMFs, you can get effects. I think that's exactly how you get the cataracts in these newborn calves, and I think that 5G will similarly produce many, many effects deep in the body through this mechanism. So I predict 5G will produce effects similar to those produced by microwave frequencies, but they will be much more severe. I also predict that there are a number of effects that are particularly associated with aqueous parts of our body, which are listed there. And I guess I'll skip over because we don't have time to talk about them. And the current plan that's already been approved by the FCC and the Congress in the US is to put out tens of millions of 5G antennae without doing one single biological safety test of genuine 5G. Europe and East Asia seem to be following in similar paths. This, in my view, is absolute insanity. Thank you very much.